What is special about the wrinkly outer layer of the brain, the cortex? And what does this have to do with the way that you come to explore and understand the world? And by the way, why do you see a whole image when you open your eyes, even though each part of your visual cortex has access to only a tiny bit of the image? And for that matter, the brain is divided into different areas for sight and sound and touch and so on. And so why, when you're petting a cat, why does the cat seem unified? Why doesn't the sight of the cat seem separate from the purring and the feel of the fur? Can we build a new model of how the brain works? And in what ways is what the brain doing something very different than what's happening in current AI? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist at Stanford. And in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Today's episode is about a new model of the brain developed by my friend and colleague, Jeff Hawkins, and we'll get into an interview with him shortly. But let me preface by saying that for centuries, people have stared at the brain and tried to figure out how this thing works, because when you stare at it, it's just a huge lump of cells. You can see that there's a wrinkled layer on the outside, and when people dissect it, they can see that that part is about 3 millimeters thick, and it looks a little different. It looks grayer, and so that part is called the gray matter, and we call this the cortex, which means bark, like tree bark. And the stuff below that thin layer is called white matter, and it looks white because the tiny data cables coming off the cells, the axons, these are wrapped in a little sheath called myelin, which makes it look white. Okay, now, what you immediately notice by looking at brains across different mammals is that all the stuff you find under the cortex, all the subcortical stuff, looks essentially the same. Horses and elephants and mice, they all have the same architecture going on that we do. They all have a thalamus and hippocampus and cerebellum and so on. But there's one thing that really distinguishes us from our cousins. And for that, we return to the gray matter, the cortex. It's not that our cousins don't have a cortex. What distinguishes us is the absolute enormity of our cortex. We humans have a ton of this stuff. So take 4 pieces of paper from your printer and place them next to each other to make one really large piece. That's how much cortex a human has if you were to spread out the wrinkles. Now, our nearest cousins, the great apes, only have about 1 piece of paper worth, and most mammals have a lot less than that. So something about the story of the runaway human success has to do with the fact that we have way more cortex for our body size than any other creature. And side note, I'm really talking about what's called the neocortex or new cortex, because we also have a little bit of paleocortex or old cortex. But the thing that really makes us outstanding is the amount of neocortex that we have. But what is this neocortex doing? Well, if you look at any neuroscience textbook, you'll see that this part of the brain, the cortex, is often drawn with different colored regions. Like this red region over here is devoted to vision, and this green one is devoted to hearing, and this yellow one to touch, and so on. But something I've been obsessed with and write about in my latest book, Livewired, is that this is the wrong way to think about it, because the neocortex is remarkably flexible. It's not a fixed map. If you are born blind, the part of your cortex that we would have thought of as visual cortex gets taken over by hearing and touch and so on. Now, let me just be really clear what I mean by taken over. The neurons there are the same. The cortex looks exactly the same from the outside, but the function of those particular neurons is now not visual. They have nothing to do with visual information anymore. Now, that same neuron, instead of firing when it detects a moving object, now it responds to a touch on your toe or hearing a B-flat note or whatever. So the little labels that we draw onto the brain, these maps that we impose, these are actually massively flexible. And as you may know, I gave a talk at TED about this a while ago, where I showed that you can feed in new kinds of information, let's say through the ears or the skin, and the brain will figure out how to deal with that data. It will flexibly devote part of its cortical real estate to that. And this line of thinking led some scientists like Vernon Mountcastle some decades ago to realize that the cells of the cortex are a one-trick pony. No neuron is inherently a visual neuron or a neuron devoted to hearing or touch or smell or taste or memory or whatever. All parts of the cortex are perfectly capable and willing to take on any job. So that suggests they're all running some sort of basic algorithm, and it doesn't matter what kind of data you feed in. Different parts of the cortex will say, cool, I'll build a representation of that data. I don't care if it comes from photons or air compression waves or temperature or whatever. I'm on the job here to build an understanding of whatever is coming in locally. Now, it's not individual neurons that are building models, but instead groups of many tens of thousands of neurons arranged in a 6-layered cylinder. So think about this like you're a geologist and you drilled out a cylinder of rock and you saw 6 layers in it, 6 sedimentary layers. That's what the neocortex looks like, 6 layers, and it's built out of these columns, which have the same types of neurons with the same connection patterns in each column. And so think about the cortex as being made of lots of these columns, like taking hundreds of thousands of grains of rice and standing them up on their end and packing them all next to each other. Now, people have known about cortical columns for many decades, since Vernon Mountcastle first discovered these in 1957. But recently, someone has pulled together several different threads to propose how this could underlie what the cortex is all about. And that someone is Jeff Hawkins and his team. And so I met with Jeff in my studio. Now, Jeff is one of my favorite people because he does theoretical neuroscience. He really tries to figure out the big picture of what the brain is doing. Now, Jeff has a very interesting history, so I'll just mention that in the 1980s, he was a graduate student at Berkeley, where he proposed a PhD thesis on a new theory of the cortex, but his proposal was rejected. And so he ended up pursuing his vision for mobile computing instead. And in 1992, he launched the company Palm, which made the Palm Pilot. If you remember that, this was this little handheld device, and you could write on it with a stylus, and it would translate your handwriting into text. And you could use this for your address book and your calendar and your contacts and note-taking. This was the first entrant into the world of portable computing, and it really changed the world. Anyhow, a decade later, Jeff returned to his original love, which was theoretical neuroscience, trying to figure out what's going on with the brain. And he wrote a book in 2004 called On Intelligence, which was very influential on me and lots of other thinkers I know. So I was very excited when Jeff recently came out with his next book that represents his last decade and a half of research. It's called 1,000 Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence, and it describes his framework for thinking about the brain. So without further ado, let's dive into a very cool new model of the brain. Okay, Jeff, so you are a theoretician. You think about the brain from a high level. We're in this era now of AI, where AI is doing all kinds of things that are amazing and no one expected. But you see the brain as being very different from what is going on with, let's say, large language models. So tell us about that.
No, that's absolutely true. The current AI wave is really amazing, but those models don't work at all like the brain. And I think you could start with one really fundamental difference. Brains work through movement. We move our bodies through the world. We move our hands over objects to touch and learn what they are. We move our eyes constantly. So the inputs to the brain are constantly changing, but mostly because we're moving through the world. And the term for that is a sensory motor system. And the brain can't understand its inputs unless it knows how it's moving through the world. So we learn by exploring, by moving different places, picking things up, touching them, and so on. And that's all animals that move in the world learn this way. So this idea that the brain is a sensory motor system has been known back in the late 1800s, but it's pretty much ignored by everybody.
Yeah, that's right.
But it leads to a very fundamental different way of how we acquire knowledge and how knowledge is represented in the brain. Whereas today's AI is most of it's built on deep learning or transformer technologies, which essentially we feed data to it. It doesn't explore it. And we feed to large language models, we just feed it language. So there's no inherent knowledge about what these words mean, only what these words mean in the context of other words, right? But you and I can pick up a cat and touch it and feel it and know its warmth, and we understand how its body moves because no one has to tell us that. We just experience it directly. So this is a huge gap between brains. Pretty much all brains work by sensory motor learning, and almost all AI doesn't. And you can just peel the layers apart and see what the differences are, and it makes a huge difference. So I'm not a fan. I'm a fan of AI today, but I don't think it's the future of AI. I don't think it's going to get you to what people really want, or truly intelligent machines.
Okay, terrific. And we'll dive into that more in a little bit. Now, when we look at, let's say, the human brain, there's lots of areas that we can point to. There's the cortex, the wrinkly outer bit. There's all these subcortical areas. When you think about intelligence and the stuff that we're going to talk about today, what is the part that you concentrate on?
Well, we concentrate first and foremost on the neocortex, which is about 75% of the volume of your brain. I mean, it's what you see. As you said, if you could take a scope, and that's what you'd see is the neocortex. And so it's a pretty dominant part of what we think of intelligence. You can't consider it completely on its own. I mean, it's connected to all these other things. And so we also study those other things in service to the neocortex. So we study the thalamus, and we study the cerebellum, and we study the basal ganglia, just because you have to know how the cortex works with these other things. But primarily our goal, and many neuroscientists' goal, is to understand the neocortex, because that's what mammals have. We've got a big one. You know, everything we think, most of what we think about being intelligent, about our ability to understand the world and generate language and see and hear and so on, is the neocortex. Not 100%, but most of it. And fortunately also, not only is it the biggest structure, but it's a very, very regular structure. So you can look at this thing, the neocortex is like a sheet of cells. It's like the size of a large dinner napkin and only a few millimeters thick, and it gets wrinkly because you stuff it in your head. That, everywhere you look on it, it looks remarkably complicated and remarkably the same. So the areas that are doing vision look like the areas that are doing language, which look like the areas that are doing touch, so look like the areas that are doing everything, really. And so there's been long speculated that there's sort of a common algorithmic principle that's applied to everything we do, all of our sensory inputs, all of our thinking, all the language. It's hard to believe, but the evidence is overwhelming. And so our research has really been to understand what is that algorithm, the cortical algorithm, often referred to as a cortical column, this repeated structure that seems to underline vision and hearing and touch and thought and everything we do. And that's just such an appealing thing to try to understand. And we've cracked it. We actually cracked it. We understand what's going on.
That's awesome. Okay, so a couple of things, right? So the way I sometimes phrase this to people is that if I had a magical microscope and could show you a part of the brain and you could see all the activity running around in the cortex there, could you tell me, is that visual cortex or auditory or somatosensory? And the answer is you couldn't tell me, and I couldn't tell you because it all looks the same everywhere.
And there's as you know, there's these experiments people have done where, well, first of all, if you have trauma to one part of the cortex, other parts will pick up the same function. You can also, people rerouted sensory inputs to different parts of the cortex in animals, and they seem to work.
So, for example, you have visual information, instead of going to the back of the brain, the visual cortex, that gets rerouted to the auditory cortex, and that auditory cortex becomes visual.
Visual cortex, right. It's incredibly powerful and flexible system. And mammals, we have a set of sensors, quite a few, actually, more than most people think, because our skin has a lot of different sensors. But other animals have different sensors, and they have cortex too. And so there seems to be this universal algorithm that can be applied, and now we know it's a sensory motor algorithm. it can be applied. And we've spent decades trying to figure this out, and we've cracked it.
Oh, that's awesome. So just before you tell us about that, so tell us what a cortical column is.
Okay, so imagine we talked about the neocortex as this sheet of cells like 3 millimeters thick. A cortical column is a little section of that going through the 3 millimeters. It can vary anywhere from like a third of a millimeter to a millimeter in diameter. It's not something you would see. It's not like it's sitting there to be plucked out, but we know they exist. And so within that, let's say it's a 3 millimeters tall and a 0.5 millimeter wide cylinder that goes across the cortex. That contains all the neural machinery that you would see anywhere in the cortex. And each cortical column, because they look like a little grain of rice in some sense, right? You can imagine lots of little grains of rice stacked next to each other. Each cortical column gets input from in parts of the brain, they get input from some patch of sensory input. So from patch of the retina, from patch of the cochlea, from patch of your skin. Other parts get information from parts of the neocortex. So the cortex is connected to cortex. But each one is looking at if you think about the primary sensory regions of the cortex, which are quite large, they're getting input from a small sensory area, right? And so people used to think that, well, if this little column is only getting input from a small part of the retina, it can't really be doing very much, right? It can't be very smart. All it could do is process a little piece of the information there, and therefore maybe it's going to detect an edge or something like that. And there's a lot of evidence for that. But we now know what happens is that the cortical columns, they get input over time from different parts of the world. So the eyes are moving like 3 times a second. And so that cortical column is going to be looking at 3 different things every second. And it can integrate how the sensor is moving, how your eyes are moving, with what it's sensing to build models that are much larger than it can sense. In the same way that you could take your finger in a dark room and say, okay, David, I want you to learn this new object. Let's call it, a coffee cup. You've never touched it. And so what you could do is you touch the coffee cup and you move your finger along and around. And as you do, you build a 3-dimensional model of the cup, even though you're only getting input from one fingertip. The eyes are doing the same thing. It's surprising. You don't realize this. So every cortical column, what we understand now, is doing this sort of processing movement information and sensor information, building what we call structured or 3D models of things in the world. So it's quite different than even most neuroscientists think about it. And there's a lot of reasons we can talk about how it was missed for all these years.
So in the cortex, you have essentially 6 layers of cells. And a column is
all 6 layers.
Is all 6 layers. It's going up and down. It's like, think of it like layers of a cake. And
right,
a column is you're taking a straw and shoving it through the top, and so you've got this.
Good analogy.
Okay, great.
You've got a straw of cake.
Okay, great. And so the idea is, if you're looking at some column in in primary visual cortex, your point, Jeff, was that it's like looking at the world through a straw. It only sees a little tiny piece of the world, but because the eyes are moving around, because you're exploring the world, this is actually getting lots of parts of information. It's exploring the world in the same way that your fingertip explores.
Right, and it has to integrate information over time. That's the key, right? And you can literally do this. You can look at the world through a straw. Yeah. Right. And you can say, oh, what am I looking at? Well, you can't tell until you start moving the straw. And then you can and you can also learn objects that way. So literally you can learn by looking through a straw, which is what one column is doing.
Got it. And in your model, there are thousands of such columns, and each one of these is learning a model of the world as it's going. So tell us about that.
Right. So I think this idea that there's all these columns is not a new idea, and that they have this fundamental algorithm. But we were, I think, one of the first people to kind of figure out what it is and what it's doing. So the trick of this thing is, it's a little tricky here. When you look out at the world, you have a sense, anybody, you have a sense where things are. I have a sense where you are relative to me. I have a sense where this microphone is relative to me. I know where my hand is relative to this cup. Now, turns out that you have any kind of sense of location in space, you have to have neurons representing it. There's nothing goes on in the brain if there aren't neurons firing, doing it. So it turns out most of the machinery in the neocortex is keeping track of where things are relative to other things. So those 6 layers, all those cells, at least half of that circuitry is tracking where the sensory input is coming from in the world. So if I move my finger over this coffee cup, the part that's getting information from the sensory, like I'm sensing an edge, for example, as I move my finger, it has to keep track of where my finger is, a location of it and its orientation relative to this cup. It's quite complicated. But that's what it has to do to build these models. And now we know how it does it. There's all this evidence for it. So the brain is just trying to keep track of where all of its inputs are in the world, all relative to other things. Then it builds up these three-dimensional models of the world.
So tell us about how it does that then.
Right. So you can think about when you're in high school, you learned about Cartesian coordinates, X, Y, Z coordinates, right? And so if I wanted to say, where are you relative to me? I might say, oh, okay, your nose is the origin. And I could say it's some distance from here and it's X, Y, and Z. Well, you have to have something like that. And but brains don't do it that way. They do it another way. And this was some very clever research in the last 20 years that people discovered in the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, these cells called grid cells and place cells, which actually operate as reference frames. They are a way of neurons to represent locations. And they work differently than X, Y, and Z. So there's no origin. It's kind of really clever how they work. Nature has discovered a different way of doing this.
So make sure you tell us a little bit about that.
Well, okay, but these are well-known things. Let's take grid cells, which are in the entorhinal cortex. What they do is these cells, if you take a set of them, individual cells are not unique. An individual cell may say, I fire at different locations in space, but if you take a set of them, they're unique. And so you can encode a unique location in space. And the key thing about them is these cells automatically update as you move. So the original grid cells are where your body is in a room. And as you move, it's called path integration. It says, okay, you're moving at this direction at this speed. So we'll just automatically update these neurons as if we know where you are, right? And so it's what sailors used to do, like dead reckoning. You would just say, oh, I'm heading north for an hour at 3 knots, therefore I'll be 3 miles ahead in this direction. So we know that these cells exist. They've been well studied. People won the Nobel Prize for these things. So we speculated that the same neural mechanisms, these grid cells and equivalents, would be in the cortex in every cortical column. And sure enough, they're finding that now. So there's all kinds of research now. They're finding in humans and other animals that there are grid cell-like structures in cortical columns.
And so what does that tell you?
It tells me that that's the mechanism by which the brain uses for reference frames. And so literally, when you build a model of something in the world, like a model of a cup or a model of anything, it's essentially what you're doing is you're saying, here's the sensation and here its location. Here's another sensation at a different location. Here's another sensation at a different location. You add all these together and you get a three-dimensional model. You can say this thing consists of these features in these locations relative to each other. And so literally in our head, we build models of the world that are three-dimensional analogs of the physical things we interact with. And that's why you appear three-dimensional to me. You're not an image, you're a three-dimensional structure, because I have a three-dimensional model of humans and I have a special model for you, David.
Okay, great. And so so you've got these columns in the cortex, they're building three-dimensional models, they're keeping track of where your fingertips are, where your eyes are. So we've got these different windows into the brain. You've got these data cables coming in, carrying spikes. It's all spikes, but some of them are carrying visual information, some auditory, some touch.
Brain doesn't know that, by the way.
Exactly right.
It's spikes or spikes.
It's all spikes. Exactly right. And so for any particular column, it might only be getting a subset of those. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, I'm not sure you mean a subset.
Well, what I mean is, if I am a cortical column that happens to be sitting in the visual cortex, then I happen to be getting visual information, but I'm not getting auditory or somatic.
So there's one of the first things we had to address with this theory is why does the world appear unified, right? I don't feel like, I don't feel like, oh, I'm touching something with my hands and I'm looking at something else with my eyes. It's all one thing. There's this cup, right? And I feel the warmth of it. And I know it's one thing. And yet we have all these different models. So it turns out you have models of cups that are tactile models. They're based on how it feels. You have models of how it looks. You might even have a model of how it sounds. Like this particular ceramic cup, I have an expectation what it would sound like I put on this counter here. It might be different on a ceramic counter. And yet these models they're all independent, but they're not completely independent. So there's these long-range connections in the cortex that go from all different sides, the left side of the brain, the right side of the brain, all over the place. There's lots of different types. But what they're essentially doing is they're voting. They're all saying, like, my finger says, I think I'm touching something that feels like a cup. And I may not be certain. Another finger, I have something too I'm not really certain. And the eyes thing, and they very quickly are reaching the only thing that makes sense for all of our input is we're all looking at the same object. And so there's like across these long-range connections, it'll solidify into a percept. That's what you perceive. You don't actually normally perceive the individual sensations from your eye or your fingers. You just say, I'm holding this cup in my hand. Yeah. And it's one percept. And so it's these long-range connections and how these columns vote all the time. This is why I can flash an image in front of your eye and say, okay, well, each column is looking at a part of that image. Who decides what the whole image is? Right? And by the way, I don't even have time to move my eyes. Once I've run into objects, I don't have to move my eyes to recognize them in what we call a flash inference. The reason is because each part of the cortex, visual cortex, it has hypotheses about what it might be seeing, and they vote, and the only thing that makes sense is the final thing they agree upon. So I have to learn by moving my eyes, by attending to different things and moving my fingers, but I don't always have to infer or recognize things by movement. I don't always have to. I can just flash an image in front of you, and you can say, oh, I know what that is, and you don't have time to move your eyes. This fooled a lot of vision researchers for many years because they assumed that movement wasn't necessary because I can flash an image in front of you. But you can't learn that way. You have to learn by attending to different things.
Quite right. Just so it's clear to the audience, so this issue about voting, it's not that they're all submitting their votes to some central agency. It's that they're all talking with one another. Simultaneously. And something about the spike patterns pulls into shape.
Right. Well, we know exactly how this occurs. We have models of it and we've simulated it and it matches the neuroscience. It takes a little while for people to get the sense of it. You're right. There's no central voting tally. And all the columns don't have to talk to all the other columns. It turns out they only have to talk to a few other columns as long as everyone talks to somebody and the whole thing is connected. See, it doesn't have to like a gazillion connections. But it's more like you have a imagine neurons are spiking. And let's say I have 5,000 neurons that are representing what I'm seeing. That's not that many, actually. So 5,000 neurons. And in the brain, we're getting a little technical here, activations are typically sparse, meaning of those 5,000 cells, maybe only 2% or 100 are active at any point in time. The others are silent. And so I'm representing something by saying there's 100 neurons active out of 5,000. Now, if I wasn't certain, I might say, oh, well, let's do this. I'm going to say it could be object A, it could be object B, it could be object C, and I'm going to activate them all at the same time. So now I have 300 neurons out of 500. They're simultaneously active. Now that might seem confusing, but it isn't. Neurons have no trouble with this. And everybody's doing the same thing. They're all putting multiple hypotheses. And it very quickly says, you're supporting this hypothesis and you're supporting this hypothesis. It happens simultaneously. No one has to go through thoroughly. There's no like counting the votes or let's try this hypothesis and this. It all settles very, very quickly. It's kind of a cool thing.
Have you thought about what happens when you settle on a hypothesis and then you switch? For example, looking at the Necker cube, this cube made out of 12 lines. What you see it one way, then you see it the other way. What is it that allows it to switch?
All right. Now, imagine a Necker cube is a two-dimensional image, right? It's a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional wireframe cube or something like that, right? And so it's not three-dimensional. It's really two-dimensional. But your brain wants to make it three-dimensional, right? Because it doesn't know two-dimensional things that look like that. Yeah. And so everything we try to do fits into our models, right? And we don't say, oh, that's a two-dimensional image. It can't be a cube. No, you say, oh, no, that's got to be a cube because I know cubes. I don't think it looks like that. It's not a cube. So it wants to settle on a hypothesis like, okay, well, this corner is in front of that corner and this corner is behind that corner, this corner to the left of that corner. It just has to do that to fit its models.
That's right. But why doesn't it land on a hypothesis and stick there?
Well, I don't really know, but there's other people who hypothesize about this, is that the evidence goes both ways, right? There's multiple hypotheses.
It's equiprobable.
And so neurons have a way of getting tired about what they're doing. And after a while, they say, literally, they have a way of, they say, I'm not going to keep flying like this forever. Things are changing the world. We don't just get stuck. So there's various speculated mechanisms for how neurons, and it's been observed, will sort of, say, okay, I'll be active for a little while, but then I'm going to stop and let someone else try something, right?
Got it. But what it means is that the other hypothesis has to be kept alive somewhere, somehow.
Well, it may be not. It may be just like, I have this hypothesis, I locked in on it, and now I'm going to say that's no longer possible. Just go back to square one. What is possible? So it's not like I have these two images in my head. Conceptual or perceptually, you don't feel that way, right? You
Right.
see only one or the other. So you lock in the one, the other is forgotten. But then if I say disable the first hypothesis, we're not going to allow that be anymore. Then it says, okay, what's possible? Oh, this one's possible. I'll switch to that one. It's not like they're both active. One's active and then it gets tired and then the other one goes, well, I work.
So coming back to the main thing, one part that I want to return to is just this issue that a particular column might only be receiving touch information. Another column might be receiving only auditory information and so on.
Well, they build independent models, right? I have a tactile model of an object. I have a visual model of an object, right? They're not the same. The visual model of the object will have color, perhaps. The tactile will have temperature and texture and things like that. So they're different models, but because they can vote, you have a single percept of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the things that's important here, which of course you and I both emphasize this a lot in our books, is that all we are ever seeing is our model of the world.
Right.
And so we don't have any direct access to what's actually out there. And so the fact, you mentioned earlier the binding problem. I don't know if you mentioned it by name, but the binding problem is this issue that when the coffee cup is here and it's moving, how come the color doesn't bleed off the cup and how come it seems like one thing and so on?
Binding problem is a poorly defined problem.
Exactly.
It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So you got to be really careful to say, let's talk about the binding problem. I might have a different perception of what the binding problem is. To me, the binding problem is the one I've already discussed, which is you have these different sensory inputs that, but somehow they lead to a single percept and you can switch back and forth. It's like, how do I bring these things together? How do I say these are all the same thing? And people used to think in the binding problem is like, oh, if I have the auditory cortex and the visual cortex and somatosensory cortex touch, then they must all project to someplace where they are bound together into a single model. And we flipped that on its head. They don't bind together. They bind together through just long-range connections, but there's no central place they have to do that. There's nobody sitting on top of it and saying, hey, what's your vote? What's your vote? No, it's just like, so we don't need a model that incorporates all the aspects of objects. We have independent models that we can invoke as needed, and they all vote to reach this common consensus. So I have no problems navigating, doing things in the dark. I have no problems doing things just by vision. I can do things sometimes with audition. Like I know the same things are going on. I have the same model of the world, right?
Yeah.
If I'm walking at night between my bed and the bathroom and it's pitch black, I still have the same model of the house. I still know where the door is going to be and everything else, but I can do it with touch versus vision, right? So there isn't a central model that says, here's the model of my house of touch and vision, hearing. It's all these independent models. Right.
And now the reason you called your book 1,000 Brains, or you call this hypothesis the 1,000 Brains theory,
right.
is precisely because you've got all these cortical columns and they're each making a little model of the world and they're all talking to one another.
Right.
So, hi, this feels like a coffee cup. This looks like a coffee cup. This sounds like a coffee cup when I place it down. This is the temperature of a coffee cup and so on. And so these are all talking with one another.
So the reason I call it 1,000 Brains is that each cortical column is doing what the entire brain is doing, right? Each cortical column is a sensory motor learning system. And when we ask where is a model of something, we've been talking about this, where is a model of the skull or the microphone or whatever, so many things we know. Where is that model? It's not, it's in many different places. So there's 1,000 models of coffee cups. There's 1,000 models. You don't perceive that, but they exist. And so it's like, it was really trying to capture that original idea that cortical columns are common and that there's all these different models out there that are different and they can vote on one, they vote to reach a consensus.
Yeah. And that's certainly consistent with the idea that, for example, if someone is born blind and their visual cortex gets taken over by hearing and touch and so on, they are better at hearing and touch, presumably because they just have a lot more real estate devoted towards
Right. More real estate and a lot more practice too, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's amazing how flexible it is.
Yes. Given your model of the brain, let's talk about AI and what you think is going on currently with LLMs and what that is missing.
Right. LLMs flipped is interesting. Well, let me start with a criticism of AI in general. Okay. AI has always been focused on what they call benchmarks. Like, how well can you solve a problem? So how well can the system recognize images? How well it can play chess? How well it can play Go? How well it can translate from one language to the other? And they have all these benchmarks, and everyone competes against these benchmarks, so they're kind of diverse all over the place. That's the wrong way to think about it. Let's use computers as an analogy. When we say something is a computer, we don't base on what it's doing. We base on how it works. Alan Turing and John von Neumann defined what we now call a universal Turing machine, which is like, okay, if a system has memory and a processor, and the memory has data and instructions, and you can change the instructions and change the data, it can do anything. And that is a computer. So I can say my toaster is a computer, even though it's a very limited computer, because it has one of those things inside, right? If it was a hard-coded with springs and wires and stuff, it wouldn't be a computer. But because it has a little microprocessor that has those definitions, it's a computer. So that's how we do it in the computer world. We say these are the functions that it has to perform, and you can apply it to big problems, little problems, different types of problems all over the place. And AI, we've been focused on this idea that, benchmarks, and we always want to beat some human. Well, like a dog, almost everyone who has a dog says it's intelligent, right? But it doesn't have language, it doesn't play chess, it doesn't play Go. But why do we say it's intelligent? Because we can tell that dog has an internal model of the world. It's kind of like my internal model. It knows where the door is. It knows how to go on a walk. And so why focus on this issue of like, well, it's not intelligent because it doesn't play Go better than the best human player? So I think part of the problem was that people didn't know how brains worked. And so if you don't, what are you going to do, right? We don't know it. We know enough to build this stuff. So I think in the future, that's what's going to be. We're going to say AI systems don't have to be like humans. They don't even have to do the same things humans do. Some of them are going to be very dedicated, very focused tasks. Some are going to be very broad. Some might be, engineers building space stations. All this huge variety, but they're all going to work on the same principles that biology has discovered. Today's AI doesn't work on those principles. Most of it, if we talk about the large language models, these are transformer models, we feed in a string of tokens, basically words or word-like things, and it just learns the structure of that string, and it's very good at what it does, but it has no inherent knowledge of the actual the world. It doesn't have a three-dimensional model of the world. It doesn't. If someone's written about it, it'll tell you about it, but it can't experience it itself. So you couldn't send one of these AI systems down into space and say, go to Mars, explore, and see what's out there that we can build things with, and here's some tools, and start building a structure. There's no way they're going to do this stuff, right? It's just not going to happen. But the kind of the tools we're working on can do that. That's what humans do. And that's the promise of AI. It's not just, targeting things that humans can do, like high-level things like, translating language or writing poems or things like that. It's really, how do you build a system that understands the world and knows how to act in that world? And that's the key.
Yeah. So given that, one of the things you wrote in your book that I thought was great was you addressed this issue of the existential threat of AI that a lot of people are banging on about, and you don't think it's a threat.
I don't think it's a threat. I mean, you have to tease it apart because so many people, like, there's different existential threats, but the one is called the alignment problem. Like, these AI agents are going to, you're going to tell what to do, but it won't be aligned with our values. And I'm just saying, they don't have any values, and it's just so far from reality. Once you understand how brains work, you say they're not going to do any of that stuff. It's hard for me to give a succinct answer to this, but I don't think that today's AI systems have any of these problems. They're not going to run away. They're not going to have their own desires. They're not going to say, "Hey, I'm awake. I need to survive." It's just,
because these current large language models are just statistical parrots that are taking a bunch of language and spitting language back out. Right,
and you can they'll apply them to robotics and other things, but they're going to be still sort of statistical parents.
Exactly.
By the way, they lack the human brain. We talked earlier, the neocortex is the biggest part of the brain, but we have a lot of other parts of the brain, and our emotional centers and what makes us humans, our drives and motivations are mostly not the neocortex, right? They're these other things. And if you provided an AI system with those other things, I might start worrying about it. But if you're just trying to model stuff, it's not a threat. We just assume that some AI system, because it can spew back language, is going to think like us and be like us and have our same motivations. Nothing like it at all.
So tell us about the 1,000 Brains project and how you're going to make this happen.
Right. So we kind of been working on this theory for decades, really. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we really had some breakthroughs and sort of all came together. And then we said, well, I always felt that this is the way we're going to build truly intelligent machines. And this is at the same time as deep learning and transformers were taking off and all this excitement about it. But that didn't distract us. We said, okay, let's see if we can start building this stuff. So for a couple of years, we had a small team that was trying to implement the thousand brains theory, modeling cortical columns, the voting, all this stuff, multisensory things, all this stuff, we're modeling it. And we decided earlier this year that the best way to go forward would to do this in an open source project. We hadn't actually told people we were doing this before. So we've created the Thousand Brains project. We're taking all of our code and putting it open source. We are taking the patents. We have a lot of patents. We're going to make a non-assert clause. We've done that, a non-assert clause on our patents. We have, we hired a team of people to open source project manager for outside people. We've already got quite a few people interested. We already have received some funding from the Gates Foundation for this, significant funding to help fund the project for a couple of years. There's a guy named John Shen at Carnegie Mellon University who's building silicon to implement cortical columns. So there's people around the world who've been excited about our work, have been following it, and want to join in on this thing. So we figured, let's get them all together. Let's build a framework, open source project. So we built out this team. We have, it's run by the woman, Vivian Clay, who's just brilliant, and technical side is by a guy named Niels. And so we're just starting this, so we actually haven't officially, and we've talked about it, but we haven't officially launched it yet because not everything is open yet. And there's a lot of stuff you have to do to get this all to work. But we're going full bore in this. And I think my hope is that anyone who's excited about the work, and there's quite a few people, can help join us and work on this and propel it forward and really create not only just an alternate form of AI, sensory motor AI based on brain principles, but I think what's going to be actually the ultimate primary source of AI, which is brain modeling. Our Thousand Brains project.
This is amazing. So how do people get involved in this?
You can just go to our website, Numenta and .com, and there's a lot of information there already, tons of information. It's like we have all the stuff we've accumulated, documentation, code, videos, we're getting all that up there, plus tutorials and so on. So you go to our Numenta.com, and it'll be obvious how to sign up to be informed of what's going on or how to get involved.
Great. So if some listener to this podcast says, I want to get involved and understand more about this thing, go to Numenta.com and they can
first of all, they'll sign up to getting notified about things are happening. They can get educated on the whole project. They can, I don't think right yet they can contribute code yet, but that will happen within a month or so. It'll be obvious how to get started. There's a lot of information to learn. I would think if you haven't, you might want to start with just by reading the book, The Thousand Brains, because it gives you not only the basics of the theory, but it also gives you the vision about how this is going to play out over time.
And so the idea is, just so I'm straight on this, so the idea is a person can download the code and run this model?
Right. First, we're making so that you can do that. You can run our current experiments.
Okay.
You can recreate them. You can apply them in different ways.
Great. So something that you and I have in common that we are obsessed about is this idea that we're living inside our own internal models. This is all a construction. And you had a line in the book that I loved, which is that if you had different sensors for picking up different information in the world, we would have a different perceptual experience, like a completely different experience of the universe.
Well, maybe completely, not completely. Like a blind person we're learning the worth of touch, and a person who is deaf, and a person maybe who has sensory problems on his hand, they will end up with a similar structure of the world.
Sorry, but what I mean is not in terms of how we pick up on the visible light range, but I pick up on infrared and you pick up on radio waves.
Okay, right. You might. If you really did that, then you would have a different view of the world. Like it's often, like you take the issue of color, it's often said that bees, see in the ultraviolet and we don't. So what looks like to us is a white flower, to them is this beautifully colorful, variegated flower.
But let's say you saw in a totally different part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and so you see in the microwave range.
Right.
Question is, would we have color at all?
I don't know. Yeah. It's hard to say, right? There's an underlying, really interesting philosophical problem called qualia, which is like, why does color feel like color, right? And it doesn't feel like sounds or tactile sensations. And it's an interesting challenge to understand that. I've written about it a bit.
Do you have a hypothesis about this? I'll tell you what mine is, but
tell me about yours.
It's only sort of half one, which is, I think it's about the structure of the data coming in defines the qualia. Now, I don't know why or how that's true, but with the eyes, you've got two-dimensional sheets of data coming in. And so vision feels like something. With hearing, it's a one-dimensional signal. It's just going up and down and vibrating your eardrum. That feels like something. You don't confuse vision with hearing. Those feel like completely different worlds to you. My interest has been in what happens when we feed new structures of data.
You've done a lot of interesting stuff in this area.
Exactly. Would you have a completely new qualia? Is it possible?
I think so. I mean, certainly you can imagine. First of all, I agree with you. Again, it's all spikes, right? So there's no color spikes. There's no heat spikes. It's just spikes. And so obviously the different qualia has to come about somehow from the structure of the data spatially and temporally. And also sensory motory. It's like how things change as you move. And I think that's a big part of it. So I agree with on a fundamental level that it has to be somewhere in the data and it's nothing else. And we can then ask ourselves something like, well, imagine you've been blind your whole life. You don't have a sense of color. You've never experienced color. And so to you, it'd be kind of mysterious thing. Someone could say, well, can't you tell that's this type of orange and that type of orange? What are you talking about, right? They'd have to accept that you have some super sense and the world looks different to you because you have vision and I don't. And they may be able to touch things that, sense things that I don't sense. So like if you ever try to read Braille, if you're not a Braille reader, it feels like, what? It's a blur, right? So they say, oh no, I feel everything there, right? So we can just ask ourselves the questions like, what's the world like to different people? And sometimes we'll end up with a similar model. Like, you and I would have, no matter what sensors you have, we'd have the model of physical structure of a coffee cup. But other times it could be quite different, And certainly if you start like sensing parts of the radio spectrum or other things, it'd just be, one of the things I always wondered, like, what would it be like if you had smell sensors at the end of your fingers, right? And then everything you touch, well, we have temperature sensors, and we have tapping, we have all kinds of, but what if you smell? Like you could tell chemicals that were on the surface of objects. This is what dogs do. Dogs, they don't just smell. They stick their nose right on the thing and they smell. They move to the next spot and they smell. Dogs build this three-dimensional structure of smells. We don't have that. Smells for us is kind of like wafting in from some direction, right? Dogs have this incredible model of the world, smell model. And it's hard to imagine what it is, but I'm sure they have it. So I think it's fun to think about these things. I don't, in the future, we'll build machines that perceive the world differently than we do, but that'll be great.
Okay. Jeff, this has been wonderful. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, David. It's always great talking to you. I enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. And I love your podcast, so.
That was Jeff Hawkins, theoretician and author of 1,000 Brains. Now, I love his model because it builds on previous research and gives us a possible starting point for how this whole system might be working. This is a view of the brain in which you don't have just a single model of the world being constructed, but hundreds of thousands of little models, each viewing the world through their little straw. And these models are independent, but they're not completely independent. So they communicate with each other and they vote. And in this way, the whole system converges on its best guess of what's going on out there in the world. And by this mechanism, we construct a full three-dimensional representation of the environment around us with its sights and sounds and three-dimensional structure. So this gives us a clear framework for thinking about the neocortex. Now, we might not know for a while if this answers everything or it needs some tweaking or if there are far better models coming down the pike. But what I absolutely love about this is that this is where the endeavor of science shines, taking something that seems insanely complex, 86 billion neurons with 200 trillion connections, something of such vast complexity that it bankrupts our language, and saying, wait, what if there's a really simple principle at work here? What if there's a way that we could reduce all that complexity by just looking at this from a new angle? So let me give an analogy here. Just think about what it would be like if you had a magical microscope with which you could look into a cell and into the nucleus in the middle, what you would see is mind-boggling complexity there. You'd see millions or billions of molecules racing around and interacting and doing God knows what. And you'd say, wow, there's no way we're ever going to understand this. But then Crick and Watson come along and say, actually, the important thing is this DNA molecule and keeping the order of these base pairs, and all the rest is housekeeping. And suddenly the fog of confusion lifts. Now, something that seemed well beyond us can be described in a sentence or two, and science leaps forward. And things move fast from there. I worked with Francis Crick when I was in my postdoctoral years, and now I look around me at Stanford and Silicon Valley, and there are thousands of laboratories and companies doing amazing work with genomes. And their existence results entirely from this one simplifying insight about DNA in 1953, that new model that suddenly clarified what is happening inside the nucleus. By the same token, this is what we're trying to do with the brain. Brains appear to be ferociously complex, and yet we have lots of brains running around the planet. We've got 8.2 billion of them. So something must be straightforward about their architecture, or else Mother Nature wouldn't be able to build these over and over with such reliability. You couldn't drop this massive quantity into the world and have them all functioning well unless there was something pretty uncomplicated about building and running a brain. So that is the overarching game of science, to take the overwhelming complexity around us and to find new angles to look at things to reveal simplicity. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.